Good afternoon. So today I'm going to start by talking a little bit or laying out some of the metrics for a sustainable bioeconomy, and then talking about some of the choices we face in terms of particularly feedstocks to achieve those, and the policies that need to go along with that in order to get us to moving towards a more sustainable bioeconomy. So in particular, some of the key definitions for what would be sustainable would be to have biofuels and bioproducts that are competitive with fossil fuels, that can be supported by a market economy without policy incentives. If we could optimize our production practices so that we can minimize competition between food and fuel production and suitably allocate land across the different uses for it. And in part, this could be achieved by more efficient land use so that we can grow biofuel crops on marginal land without diverting productive cropland. And then finally, produce feedstocks that can provide ecosystem services that are better than what we are currently getting from the use of land, in particular, such as clean air and water, healthy soils, and habitat. And there are numerous choices for achieving those. We've got a variety of different choices in terms of the types of biofuels that could be produced. We've currently got corn and sugarcane biofuels that are dominating the landscape, and we're talking here about cellulosic processes that could be produced from a variety of different feedstocks that are, many of which are completely novel, dedicated energy crops such as miscanthus, switchgrass, and others. So we did an analysis of looking at, well, what would a future with 16 billion gallons of cellulosic biofuel in 2022, if we were to fully implement the RFS, look like? And using current estimates about costs of production, how these might decline over time, and what we know from the last 5-6 years of research that we've been doing in terms of the greenhouse gas benefits we could get. And what we find is that if we could indeed get to that, we would have 6% lower greenhouse gas emissions from the transportation sector as compared to a no policy scenario. We could grow the types of energy grasses and the crop residues and so on needed to meet this goal. Largely by 75% of that would be grown on marginal land without diverting crop production. If we were to, in fact, implement the dollar per gallon cellulosic biofuel production tax credit, then that would make cellulosic biofuels even more competitive relative to even corn ethanol, leading to a greater switch towards those, and we could double the amount of greenhouse gas reductions we could get from the RFS. And all of this could be achieved while there was a 1 to 2% increase in the vehicle miles traveled. And so we are able to continue to get the energy services we need from the transportation sector and yet reduce the carbon intensity, and do this without a significant increase in food crop prices, because this would be largely done from crop residues, wastes, and energy crops. But there are numerous challenges to getting to this, and they're both economic and policy challenges, and of course there is a technology challenge behind this. But to achieve this goal, what we need is high-yielding, low-carbon, low-input, dedicated energy crops. If we have to produce 16 billion gallons, we have to move beyond the crop residues, crop and forest residues, to in fact having dedicated energy crops. We need a cost-competitive conversion technology, and then policy options really along the entire supply chain, not just focusing on the fuel side of it and incentives for blending it, but also really for producing the feedstocks by the farmers, because these are new crops that are not yet currently being produced. And so we need incentives for producing feedstocks, low-cost innovation loans. We've sort of already begun talking about that. We need to ease the blending constraints so that there is increased demand for the biofuels that are being produced. And then, of course, we need the renewable fuel standards to assure the demand by the blenders so that there is investment in these. As we look at the landscape of possible choices for feedstocks, it is indeed immense. And this is just a very small list of possibilities of what could be used. There's research going on a number of other potential candidate crops. And a lot of this research is being done on experimental fields, such as the one, we have a 300-acre energy farm at the University of Illinois, where we are growing and measuring and monitoring these crops in order to understand their environmental impacts, their yield, production practices, and so on. And the interesting thing about these is that given the diversity in terms of the feedstock, there's a lot of diversity in their environmental impacts and the cost of producing them and their land requirements. And so we see that, in fact, as compared to, say, corn ethanol, if you were to use miscanthus or energy cane, you could get twice as many gallons of biofuel per unit of land, and that is important because we know land is going to be one of the limiting factors in our ability to use it for all of the very many uses that we have in mind. So using it efficiently is critical for sustainability. And then in addition to that, the fact that we could grow these on low quality soils. And so we did a study looking at the extent to which, in fact, this anecdotal evidence that had been there about the potential to grow these was in fact was supported by science. And we find that there is some reduction, 5 to 10% on average, if we grow switchgrass and miscanthus on low quality soil. But if you combine that with the economics, where we know that low quality land is also cheaper in terms of its cost of conversion to these alternative uses, then it turns out that it is much cheaper to grow. It'll be greater economic incentives to grow these on low quality land than on productive cropland. And so here we find that the trade-off really across these different feedstocks in terms of the greenhouse gas savings we can get, the cost of production, and where you could grow these. And so in the case of corn stover, you can get about 50 to 90% savings in greenhouse gas emissions, even with 30% or 50% harvest rates. There's still a loss in soil carbon, and so the overall greenhouse gas savings with corn stover are about 50 to 90%, which if it is in fact 50% in some cases, then it would make it lower than what the RFS requires as a threshold for cellulosics. But in some cases, these are cheaper than the alternatives. And so there is an incentive, at least in the short run, to use corn stover. Switchgrass can get us higher greenhouse gas savings, but in many cases the cost can be quite high because the yield of switchgrass is not as large as, for example, in the case of miscanthus, where particularly if miscanthus is grown on low quality lands, you get significant greenhouse gas savings where it's in fact negative, so it's a sink for carbon and not a source, and it could be cheaper in many cases than the alternatives. There's also other ecosystem services that come with these types of energy crops, and in particular, both switchgrass and miscanthus are really excellent for reducing nitrate loadings into watersheds. And in fact, comparing this to corn, we find that the 3 to 4 years after these crops have been established, nitrate loadings could go down to 5 to 10%, as opposed to, say, 50% compared to with corn. But of course, these biofuels we know are much more expensive, particularly with the low oil prices. That makes it uneconomical to produce these on large scale. But if we look at the sort of experience that we've had with corn and sugarcane ethanol, we can see that it was similar in the case of those industries. And so these costs have come down tremendously in the last 3 to 4 decades, with cumulative production increasing over time. And of course, that production was supported by policy, otherwise it would not have happened. And so that's the kind of policy that is needed to force the technology to improve over time with experience and in order to get to the point where it becomes cost competitive. Now, we want to not only look at improve the competitiveness of the fuel conversion technology, but also think about the feedstocks, because now we're looking at feedstocks, many of which are these novel feedstocks that require new supply chains to be developed. And so this is very risky for farmers. And this is one of the big barriers to the production of these new feedstocks. One is risk, and the other is the fact that farmers tend to have very high discount rates. Their time preference for giving up current returns, having high upfront costs, which, for example, in the case of miscanthus could be as high as $1,000 to $1,200 per acre, and waiting for 15 years in order to recover that investment that's a significant disincentive to do that. And so we need programs that would in fact offset some of these incentives. Here we looked at the yield risk from growing miscanthus and switchgrass relative to corn. And so the areas which are green show areas where miscanthus is less risky or switchgrass is less risky than corn. The areas that are red are the ones that are higher risk. So switchgrass is much more riskier than miscanthus, and in many places miscanthus is less risky than corn. But if we translate that into a risk premium, we find that for a variety of economic reasons, in fact, large areas would require a significant risk premium for risk-averse farmers to grow them. And so this is above the break-even price that's typically assumed when feasibility studies are done, which assume that farmers are risk neutral and would grow this at cost. So in order to overcome some of these disincentives, we have the Biomass Crop Assistance Program, which is really a great program in that it provides the establishment cost share subsidies, which would reduce the upfront investment costs for farmers. It covers the opportunity cost of land, which is the foregone income during the first 5 years or whatever it takes to establish these crops. And so, it offsets some of the disincentives from low biomass price, liquidity constraints for farmers, and high discount rates. In the 2014 Farm Bill, it was funded only at $25 million a year, so the funding is clearly not going to be enough to support even the first billion gallons of biofuel that would be needed. Even out of this, at least half could be spent on crop residues. So how do we reap and realize some of the benefits of these advanced biofuel policies? Some of it's already been discussed today and through this conference. The most important really is a credibly implemented RFS, which would provide the certainty of demand that's needed to stimulate investment. And followed by that is the cellulosic biofuel production tax credit, which would reduce the disincentives for blending and the cost of this while this technology is maturing for consumers. But longer term, in order to move towards the lower carbon and the more sustainable biofuel so that it's not just the crop residues, we need to have low carbon fuel policies. And so we've looked at, for example, a national low carbon fuel standard, which is sort of an extension of the LCFS policy that is there in California, which would create these performance-based incentives rather than a volumetric mandate, a performance-based incentive for continuous improvement in lowering the greenhouse gas intensity below the 60% threshold. And that would offset one of the disadvantages of the RFS, which is that it treats all biofuels the same. And then a cap and trade or a carbon price would be another way to reward the blenders as well as the farmers who are producing these fuels and sequestering carbon in the soil and creating carbon credits. From the experience from California, we can see that in fact the LCFS does work. This graph here shows how between 2011 and 2014, the share of the high carbon corn ethanol has been declining. Lower carbon fuels, even including corn ethanol, biodiesel, and renewable diesel is increasing, including CNG. The carbon intensity of diesel as well as gasoline blends has been declining, as shown by the orange and the green lines. And all of this has been achieved through the market, which determines what mix of fuels is to be used, what's the most cost-effective way to lower greenhouse gas intensity, and this shows the carbon prices that have emerged in the marketplace in order to incentivize this production. So in summary, we need a credible RFS to continue development of these advanced biofuels, but we also need demand-side policies. So it isn't enough to have just a supply-side focus. You need to increase demand so that biofuel consumption can increase, supplement it with low-carbon fuel policies like the LCFS that provide the signal needed to transition towards the biofuels that have these multidimensional environmental benefits that I just mentioned. Policies like BCAP, which are aimed at incentivizing farmers to grow the land, to convert land to these sustainable energy crops. And then, of course, other policies are needed to overcome some of the unintended consequences which are inevitable, such as leakage, the shuffling of fuel, as well as indirect land use change and other policies, other adverse environmental and social impacts. And so let me stop with that, and I'll be happy to answer questions later on. Thanks.